Good morning, everyone. We as a people, for almost 2,000 years have developed phenomenal instincts and nuances in the way we mourn about Jerusalem. We're really good at it. And we've made mourning into an art form. And one of the most interesting things about that art form is that it doesn't contain merely the wallowing in our own self-pity. But we've spent a lot of time and a lot of Torah trying to figure out what's a good way to mourn the loss of Jerusalem. And we've only had 50 years to figure out what does it mean to be the sovereign of Jerusalem. And we are nowhere as skilled and as nuanced in being the sovereigns of Jerusalem as we were in being its mourners. And our challenge in 217 is to begin to change that reality, to change that imbalance. And as we could see with the recent discussions at the Kotel, or debates and events of the Kotel, we're not, at least from the perspective of the Jewish people, we're not good at being sovereigns of Jerusalem. Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish people is not something that's working the way we would want it to work. We have to now go back to some of the core ideas that we've put forth, that we've given, that we've associated, that Jerusalem has inspired, and to ask, how do we control these ideas so that it gives us the Jerusalem that we yearn for? How do we take control of Jerusalem, not physically? I know physically, Har Habayit B'Yadeinu, Jerusalem is in our hands. But how do we take control over the story? How do we take control over this city? Can you really take control over this city? Or is it something that maybe we don't deserve to be sovereign over? Is it something that maybe nobody should be sovereign over? Because it plays with your mind. It plays with you in ways that are very troubling. I would like to begin the journey of Jerusalem with a little humility. Not on my part, don't worry. I'll do that later. But a humility of the Jewish people. One of the things we Jews love to talk about is how Jerusalem is ours and not yours. Now, we don't have a problem with Christians because it's simple. If Jerusalem wasn't Jewish, it's not Christian. That's why when Arafat didn't understand why Clinton was so upset when he wanted to confide in him and say, we know that Jews really never had control in Jerusalem, and that sort of creates some minor difficulties with Christian narrative. But we love to point to Muslims and to say, you don't really have any claim on Jerusalem because Jerusalem is not mentioned in the Quran. It's mentioned in Hadith, but it's not mentioned in the Quran. We, however, also don't have any mention of Jerusalem in the 5 books of Moses. The parallel of the Quran is not the prophets and the writings. The parallel of the Quran is the 5 books of Moses. And in the 5 books of Moses, there is also no Jerusalem. It's not mentioned. All that's mentioned is the place that God will choose to designate God's name there. That's all. And as you saw in Samuel, God explains, God says very literally, when David wants to build the temple, he says, I've never chosen a place. I didn't want a place. I was frankly happy with a moving place and a little schleppy, schlumpy tent was fine with me. I didn't need Jerusalem. What you're doing was, did I ever ask of you? I have never picked a city. So it's not, well, through the eyes of Samuel, it's not an oversight of the Bible that Jerusalem is really mentioned. The opposite. The whole midrash in which we take, where God says Adonai, where Abraham calls it Adonai Yireh, and they do a merging of Adonai Yireh and Shalem into Yerushalem, is actually contradicted. This is not Jerusalem. God didn't want a city. God did not think in terms of one central, singular holy site. And so it pays, just as we begin our journey. We, like everyone else, didn't have a historical, or rather primordial legal connection to Jerusalem. We had a historical one, and that historical story starts with David. Prior to David, there was no Jerusalem. And there is a minor little issue, as we can't figure out how big David was, but we can leave that aside for now. Jerusalem starts not as being the city that God has a unique relationship for all times, but it is rather a city that we designate as God's city, and God acquiesces. But in Jewish law, in the book that determines Jewish law, Jerusalem also is not mentioned. And so now that we're more or less in other people's place, doesn't mean that we don't have a past in Jerusalem. We certainly do. But Muslims also have a past in Jerusalem too. Now we're talking history. If we're talking history, I agree, our past starts first, because at any time we come to who started Judaism, who came first, Judaism will always win. But in our sources, we don't have any extra claim, at least legally, to Jerusalem. What we do have is thousands of years of thinking about this city. We thought about it in very, very interesting ways. In the first, as you saw, we had an idea. It wasn't Jerusalem, it only became Jerusalem. That there was going to be a place where you were going to be seen by God. You weren't going to see God, according to Deuteronomy, but you were Yira'eh, the term Yira'eh kol zchurcha, over and over and over. Yira'eh zchurcha el pnei Hashem Elokecha b'makom asher yivchar. That language. I come, the commandment of pilgrimage, is a commandment to be seen by God. This idea of going to a place to be seen by God is the foundation of the Jerusalem of God. The first of our 6 Jerusalems. The Jerusalem of God is literally the place where God is present in a way very, very different from the way God is present in other places. Does that make sense theologically in a monotheistic tradition? Probably not. But it doesn't matter. Consistency is not a virtue. It isn't, it's not. And religiously, we know that the monotheistic idea was something that came too early in human development. We couldn't assimilate that idea. The idea of a God who transcends space, transcends physical form, it was not something that Jews of antiquity could handle. Whether Jews of the 21st century could handle it is a separate question. And so our tradition speaks of a place that you are seen by God, by which it implies that if you don't go on Aliyah LaRegel, you're not seen by God in the same way. This God who is the creator of the universe has a particular place where the divinity is thicker. It's literal. How exactly? Nachmanides offers the idea that while God is the king of the whole universe, under God there lies these demigods who watch over the earth for God, with the exclusion of one place in which there is no demigod, and God alone remains the direct ruler over Jerusalem. This is in Leviticus chapter 18. Nachmanides, and the earth shall vomit out, v'taki ha'aretz, and the land shall vomit out its inhabitants. And that's why in Israel, idolatry and certain practices cannot be tolerated while they are tolerable and acceptable elsewhere. That's an attempt to square some form of a monotheistic circle. But still, we believe God, ultimately, there is a place where you get closer to God. And literally, as you saw in Book of Kings, when the temple is finished, and now this place that God will choose to reside, for God's name to reside therein, is chosen as Jerusalem. The temple is built, and in a very, very clear way, it says, I'll read it in English. There was verse 9, there was nothing inside the ark on page 5. There was nothing inside the ark but the 2 tablets of stone which Moses placed there at Horeb when the Lord made a covenant with Israel after the departure from the land of Egypt. When the priests came out of the sanctuary, why? For the cloud had filled the house of the Lord. And the priests were not able to remain and perform the service because of the cloud. For the presence of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. This is not a metaphor. Literally, the Jerusalem of God, God resides there, and it is so thick that you can't even stay there. Literally, you have to leave the room. God's presence forces you out of that space. God resides in a physical space. And Jerusalem, one of its core ideas is that here you meet God. For many, that's one of the reasons why Jerusalem makes you crazy. The idea of being so close to God is something that what does that mean? What does that do to you? Can human beings handle that idea? Now, what does it mean to be the sovereign over the Jerusalem of God? The sovereign over the city that God literally resides in differently. For many, throughout history, the battles of Jerusalem, over Jerusalem, who was going to be sovereign over Jerusalem, was the battle in essence over who was going to be sovereign of God. And we always know, and I've written about it and we've spoken about it over and again, that one of the great paradoxes is how monotheism creates the greatest idolatry. Because it's precisely as you become a thicker believer, the fantasy that maybe you could control God, you could be the master over God's space, blows your mind. I am the ruler over Jerusalem. The amount of blood that was spilt in order to be God's master in the name of faith and piety is a great paradox of monotheism. And now we are the masters of Jerusalem. Does that mean that we are the masters of God? Who controls God's city? Does that mean that that is the person whom God loves best? Is Jerusalem the sphere of chosenness? Is Jerusalem that which takes the idea of chosenness, and whoever is the master of Jerusalem reinforces their fantasy of chosenness? Because I'm the master of God. But in our tradition, there is an additional move. A move that Moshe is going to speak about, I think, on Tuesday more, but I just want to mention it briefly now. If God is in a place, what does that do to you? Could you really be the sovereign over a place that is God's? As you saw in Exodus 19. Jerusalem was not the first place in our tradition that God resided therein. God resides in a sneh. God resides on Mount Sinai. Now, in Mount Sinai in particular, verse 21 or 20, the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai. How is this possible? Maimonides flips out. This whole thing is for Maimonides just a nightmare. Like, what am I supposed to do with God coming down on a mountain and Moses climbing up? So for Maimonides, Moses climbing up Mount Sinai is Moses climbing up the ladder of knowledge. It's not a physical, it can't be. Because what exactly is this God who's supposed to transcend space? And it's just the whole idea is impossible. But God is literally, the Lord comes down upon Mount Sinai, and there was a lot of, and when God comes, you can imagine, there's thunder, I don't know why, but there's lots of thunder and stuff, and the mountain, and the Lord called the mountain, and the Lord said to Moses, go down, warn the people not to break through to the Lord to gaze, lest many of them perish. One of the ideas that our tradition suggests is that if God is in a certain place, you certainly cannot be sovereign over it. And if you're sovereign over it, then it's not God's. So what does Har Habayit Biyadenu mean? What does this Motagor proclamation, we now own it? What is it that you own? What is it that you think you own? Can you own God's home? Or is God's home, by definition, the place that the only thing you could do is leave? And the more God is there, the less you could be sovereign there. Which idea of the Jerusalem of God we assimilate into our politic is going to be absolutely essential. Do you have this fantasy that through Jerusalem you are now in many ways the master of the universe? Are you now the master of God? Is it through Jerusalem and the control over Jerusalem that reinforces your vision of God now being in your service, as I spoke about in the opening in my opening lecture? Is this the reaffirmation of the messianic fantasy of my chosenness not merely being what God speaks about, but the way God runs the world? And now, look, who else would God allow to be the master? And we have to dig, and we have to prove. Look, to dig in the old city is not to find. I'm not trying to find my past. I'm trying to reaffirm and reassert my mastery. I own it, and I could be anywhere. This is one of the reasons also why for many Israelis the idea that we cannot go up into the Temple Mount is not only an anathema, there's something vulgar about it. I'm not saying that I want to kick out Islamic prayer, but that I can't be there? So at least now I declare I am the sovereign of Jerusalem and I can't even pray there? I'm going to come back to that in a moment under the Jerusalem prayer. But part of the fantasy of praying on the Temple Mount has nothing to do with prayer. It has to do with reaffirmation of my mastery. Now, there is a reaffirmation of my mastery which is very self-evident. I'm here too. For 2,000 years, I couldn't come near, or you controlled. You said I'm the has-been. You said, Jews, you're yesterday's story. Part of 67 means I'm home, that pride, that dignity. Why do I have to limit my ability to be present? Not to pray on the Temple Mount is to basically declare that Har Habayit is not in my hands. And the contradiction of the two is very troubling. Or is Jerusalem truly never in our hands? And if it's in God's hands, what type of religious life? If really you are now sovereign over God's mountain, which means that you're not sovereign, what does that mean for the way we rule Jerusalem and the way we act in Jerusalem? I want to just put on the table not just prayer in the Temple Mount, but also another very important act of Jewish sovereignty, very contested one, and that is every Yom Yerushalayim, what's known as Mitzad HaDgalim, the flag march, through the Muslim cordon, or the sound and light show. What do we see on one side of the wall, and what are people experiencing on the other? When you have the Yetzer Hara to be the master of God, what does that do? What does that do to you? I remember many years ago, wasn't so many years ago, in this room there were a group of a couple of hundred, 300-400 students who study in the Be'eri program, our program to teach Judaism in secular Israeli high schools. And there's 130 schools in this program. And there's a group of students who are majoring in Jewish philosophy. That means in grade 11 and 12, they're taking 5 hours, and this is the culmination. And I remember I was talking to them about Jewish identity. I said, what is it about Judaism that makes you a Jew? Like, who are we? What is it that every Jew has to accept? One person raised their hand. Yes, sir. Jerusalem shall be the undivided capital of the Jewish people for now and all eternity. That was his answer. You cannot understand the fact that you cannot win an election in Israel if you explicitly declare your willingness to divide Jerusalem, unless you understand the power, the call, the Yetzer Hara, the need for us to be sovereign, and by being sovereign over the city of God, we are present in history in a way. This is the tikkun of the galut, the tikkun of Hester Panim. Whether we are sovereign over God or married to God in new ways, we are present in history. And somehow, anytime somebody speaks about internationalizing Jerusalem for us, it's about sending us back to Galut again. But that too, the Jerusalem of God, stage one. The second Jerusalem does not believe that Jerusalem is the Jerusalem of God. As Solomon says, Ki ha'omnam yeshev Elohim ha'la'aretz, but will God really dwell on earth? The same Solomon who just a few moments beforehand fulfilled his father's fantasy of building a house for God, that house gets filled with the presence of God. People can't be there. It is literally, there's nothing, divinity literally is filling up the space, and Solomon now sits back and says, this whole thing, even the heavens and their uttermost reaches cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Jerusalem is not a city of God. There is no such thing as Solomon of a city of God. It's not that I can't be sovereign over a city of God. There is no city of God because God and monotheism doesn't limit God's self to one place. God is everywhere. And therefore, Jerusalem is no holier than any other city in the world. Jerusalem, however, has a functional holiness because we human beings cannot feel a connection to God without some form of mediation. We don't only need textual or rabbinic mediation, we need physical, spatial mediation. We need to feel that God hears us. And so Solomon prays to God and says, the temple is nothing. What's really important, are you willing to give us the sense of comfort that if I direct my prayer here, you will listen in ways that are very different than the way you listen otherwise. Jerusalem of prayer is not where we come in the presence of God. Jerusalem of prayer is where our words come and reach God. Where we are seen, not physically, but where our needs and aspirations are seen and present before God in ways that we don't experience elsewhere. It's a functional holiness, not a literal holiness. It's a concession that God makes to the incapacity of the human being to live with a God who truly transcends space and form. Now, to be in Jerusalem is to feel that my voice is heard. I remember one of the few things that I did correct as a rabbi. I had the title rabbi, but I actually had the title scholar in residence. I was good at being scholar in residence. I was really bad at being a rabbi. I didn't know how to be a rabbi. I wasn't trained in it. I knew how to teach a class. And one of my problems is that when people asked me a question, I answered what I thought. I answered what I thought, and I didn't realize that they weren't asking me what I thought. I actually had to figure out what it is that they needed to hear. And I didn't understand that. After I moved back to Israel, I had a moment of tikkun, where a student of mine calls me. She was very close to me, and she had come to all my classes for many years at the JCC. And she was about to go into surgery, and she was petrified, and she discovered that she didn't have a Hebrew name. And since she didn't have a Hebrew name, Mishaberach wouldn't work. She went to a local rabbi and asked him to give her a Hebrew name, and he said, "I can't, you're not a member of my shul." The fact that we're laughing means that it's plausible. We could imagine a universe in which this is possible. I was back in Israel at the time, and I had a moment, and I said to her, "Do you know what? When's your surgery?" "Tomorrow at 9 o'clock, New York time. That's 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Jerusalem. I'm going to give you a name right now, and I'm going to write it on a piece of paper, and I'm going to put it in the kotel before your surgery begins." I was going to be seen. Now, I had a little dilemma. Do I go or not? Like, this is a tension. This is it. And we're because we understand. Like, was just the word enough? Like, and I had this very Protestant moment, which is inconsistent for a Hartman. I must confess, the kotel is not a place that I feel particularly comfortable. Doesn't really mean that much for me. Not because I don't need space, just the whole gestalt there is not one that inspires me personally. I took a taxi, tell him wait. He parks, he waits for me, I run in, run out. I felt like as if what's going to happen if somebody sees me? It's like Donniel's putting something, it's going to ruin my reputation. Like, I've cultivated being a heretic, so like, what is this? Like, someone's going to actually... But the feeling that she had, you could feel it on the phone. I was present before God. What a question. Now, what does it mean? Not that you are sovereign over the city of God, but you are the sovereign over the place where people's voices are heard. Here, too, human beings have great difficulty. You cannot understand the Kotel conflict unless you understand the power of Jerusalem and the yearning and the understanding of Jerusalem as the city of prayer. Why would you care if all of a sudden, miraculously, someone discovers a third kotel? It's a miracle. It used to be, I could see Seinfeld. This was the kotel. It was here. It's here? Yeah, is it here? All of a sudden, it was here. This is where it was. But what we tell people is that since this is where it was, is not really where it was. Because where it was much smaller, and here, and under, and over. What was is what you think was, but was not really was. And since it was not what it was, we can now say that this third kotel is also not what it was. So this not being the classical kotel is no less of a kotel than this not being the kotel, and by implication, logically, this is as much a kotel as that kotel. Now we have a third kotel, all of which weren't what was equally. And now everybody could feel comfortable going there. You now have your place which wasn't was, and I'll give you your place which wasn't was. And what's the problem? Because it wasn't was anyway. And you don't think that was the kotel, so what do you care if I go there? Now, while we're laughing at this, everything that I just said is absolutely accurate. This is literally the discourse. And we all know that the primary debate comes down to two issues. Still to this day, we're willing to allow some verschlepzig little, it looks like some European ghetto prayer area with some rickety little stuff. What's the debate? The debate is whether we will have one security area for all three kotels. Are you familiar with that? That's the issue. Will we have one security area which everybody will join in? And whether we will then create a shared plaza which people could go here or people could go there. Why is it now in Israel, there is nobody arguing and saying we have to shut down all reform and conservative or egalitarian synagogues? Why would you be able to do that in Jerusalem? There is no, excuse me, if I don't think your prayer service, all the language about how the reform movement and the conservative movement are bringing about a destruction of the Jewish people applies to Kol HaNeshama and Navat Tehillah and Tzion and Shirach, all of them. Like, why is that that's much more dangerous. That's permeating all, you're staining the whole country with your impurity. Because Jerusalem and the Kotel is the Jerusalem of prayer. To be present in the Kotel is to feel that my voice is heard. My voice is heard by God. My voice is heard within the spiritual universe, which is Jerusalem and Judaism. And if I am the master of Jerusalem, I want to be the master of determining whose voice is heard. All the Yetzer Hara gets directed into Jerusalem. If you're present, you'd ask, what does it take from me? What it takes from me is the fantasy that I'm the sovereign over whose voice is heard. Now, can you really be the sovereign of the Jerusalem of prayer? And what are the consequences of that sovereignty? Is exactly the dilemma that we're struggling with today at the Kotel. What does it mean for human beings to actually think, I'm going to be sovereign over whose voice is heard? That fantasy and the destructive nature of it. The third idea of Jerusalem is the Jerusalem of peoplehood on page 15 and 16. Jerusalem of peoplehood understood that when Jews come to Jerusalem, they don't just meet God. When one of the deepest meanings and purposes of Aliyah LaRegel is not just to meet God and to be seen by God, but it's to see and be seen by your fellow people. Jerusalem as capital. Jerusalem as the one place, as you saw, that all Jews, no matter where you are in the world, those in the north turn to the south, those in the south turn to the north, those in the east turn to the west, those in the west turn to the east. All of Israel, under the Jerusalem of prayer, everybody prays towards here. Under the Jerusalem of peoplehood, all of Israel are praying to the same place. That idea of one place on earth, travel wherever you may be, all the Aron Kodeshes are realigned. Jerusalem is the place where we see others. Jerusalem is the place where a person never says, Tsar li hamakom. One of the great miracles of Jerusalem, as the Pirkei Avot teaches, one of its great miracles, that no matter how many people came on Aliyah LaRegel, no matter how many people came to be seen by God, no one ever felt that they didn't have a space to be seen by God. How did that miracle occur? It occurs because under the Jerusalem of peoplehood, the fundamental requirement is tzimtzum of yourself, the contracting of yourself. Nobody ever said Tsar li hamakom because nobody ever tried to control the place. Everybody understood that essentially Jerusalem is something that must be shared. And in one of the most beautiful, it's one of the beautiful ideas of Aliyah LaRegel, that Jerusalem is also the place where you give back lost property. Now, functionally, it's actually a stupid idea. I'm living in the Galil. What do I have to bring? I know I don't have to schlep the donkey. And the Gemara deals with, do I have to schlep the donkey? Or do I have to schlep, it's just not. But why in Jerusalem? Do it in all the Arei Miklat, just like you have Arei Miklat. Divide up the country into 6. Make regional places, because chances are that if somebody lost a donkey, he's not, if you're in the Tveria, chances are it's not somebody from Beersheba who lost the donkey. Chances are he lives in Tveria. Chances are he's in Tzfat or Rosh Pina. So pick Rosh Pina between, have 6, 8, 10. Beautiful idea. You could even give them over to the protection of the Leviim. We could have such a beautiful ritual of Israel being filled with various stones of where we return our lost property. Where the person who lost something goes to stand, and the person who finds it comes to declare it. You can make it part of your Erev Shabbos preparation. It could be a beautiful thing. No, the idea that all Jews have one place, and it is here more than anything else. Giving back lost property is the expression of lo tuchal lehitalem. I see you. I see you. I see your needs, and I see myself as responsible that if you're in need, I have to be part of the solution. I don't come to Jerusalem to be seen by God. I don't come to Jerusalem merely so that my voice will be heard. I come to Jerusalem as an expression of Jewish peoplehood, of Jewish solidarity, Jewish care. Jerusalem is the place where we give expression to the fact that your Avedah is my responsibility to give it back to you. That when you lose something, when you're in pain, when something is bothering you, I have to be your solution. That's what Jerusalem stands for. And that's why it's put in Jerusalem. That idea, this is what it means to have a capital. Not a seat of government, but a place where everybody feels so welcome. And that's why everybody obviously wants to march in Jerusalem. And that leads to all the other debates, because it's very easy to have a gay parade in Tel Aviv. Do I have a gay parade in Jerusalem? The problem is, does the Jerusalem of God doesn't allow, if my notion of who's sovereign over Jerusalem or whose voice should be heard, I don't want your voice heard. Jerusalem today, and this is a great paradox, is that on the issue of liberal Judaism, Israelis are giving up the idea of Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish people. You aren't talking about your individual right to pray. You have a different vision of what Jerusalem means. And it's these fascinating moments when the person who's sovereign over Jerusalem forgets what they're sovereign over. Or rather, the Jerusalem of prayer is trumping the Jerusalem of people. Which one obligates you more? Which one do you feel demands priority? Unfortunately, very often, the Jerusalem of God and the Jerusalem of prayer become so intoxicating that the responsibilities of the Jerusalem of peoplehood are forgotten. The fourth Jerusalem is the Jerusalem of responsibility on page 22. The Jerusalem of responsibility is a direct outgrowth of the Jerusalem of God. If this is really God's place, what does it mean to be worthy to be the sovereign over this city? And in our tradition, there is obviously always a debate whether chosenness is a status that you inherit or a responsibility that you incur. Is Jerusalem a status that you inherit? I am now the sovereign over the city of God. Look at me. Look whom God truly loves. That is one deep religious response. And it's a very coherent one. And it's also a very fulfilling one. And a deep sense of the pride that you feel that comes from that power and that sovereignty. But the flip side of it is that we very rarely end with chosenness as a status you inherit, and always add to it a responsibility that you incur. Solomon is told, or David is told, that he can't build a temple because his hands are stained in crime, in blood. If you have blood on your hands, since this is the house of God, since this is the city of God, not everybody gets to walk here. And it's not simply an issue, if any of you saw in Masechet Kelim, over who's pure and impure. It's not simply that the more God is present, the less people could show up. The more impure, the standards of purity are stricter and stricter and stricter. It's not just an issue of pure and impure, it's also a question of the purity of your soul and of your heart. Solomon knows right away when he says, with regard to this house you are building, if you follow, then the word of the Lord came to Solomon, with regard to the house that you are building, if you follow my laws and observe my rules and faithfully keep my commandments, I will fulfill for you the promise that I gave to your father David. I will abide amongst the children of Israel, and I will never forsake my people Israel. To be the master of Jerusalem requires fidelity to Jewish law. Herein lies one of the great challenges of the state of Israel. Because here, when we disagree as to what constitutes Jewish law, it has direct political consequences. Because if my ability to remain sovereign is dependent on my fulfilling my understanding of what the law requires, then it truly is a zero-sum game. I can't allow the Jerusalem of peoplehood. Because the Jerusalem of peoplehood, if that means that I have to give not to your physical body space, but to your spiritual world space, I could be undermining my ability to be sovereign over Jerusalem. If your presence will plant a cancer in our midst, if part of my theology is that while God's actions are complex and beyond my understanding, when it comes to Jerusalem, it's really simple. You don't get to control Jerusalem unless Jerusalem is the way Jerusalem should be. And that leads you. Is Jerusalem the capital of Israel, or that which will destroy the Zionist idea? Because could Zionism contain that belief that your sin is not your sin. Your sin is my destruction. Because one of the fundamental principles of liberal democracy is freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of all these freedoms. And your freedoms end where? When you cause physical harm. And as long as you're not causing physical harm, I cannot limit your rights. But what happens if I theologically have a perspective that your religious practices are causing me physical harm? Then the whole idea of Israel as either the homeland of the Jewish people or Israel as a Jewish democracy are impossible. And the front line of that is Jerusalem. It's right here. And that's why the issue of the gay parade was so significant. What type of city is this going to be? Are we going to continue this notion that one person, that you are endangering my physical survival or not? Or are we going to enter into, is Israel going to be a normal country in which that type of argument is an argument that you might believe, but that type of argument has no standing either in our courts and nor in our government or in our public space? Very complicated. The Jerusalem of responsibility is a very, very complicated idea. I'd love it to stop with your hands are stained with blood. But Judaism is not, keep my whole Torah, right? In telech b'chukotai, vet mishpatai taseh, v'shamartam et kol mitzvotai. Goes beyond murder. It includes Chilul Shabbos. It includes kashrus. And again, it's so interesting how the status quo is allowed to change in so many places around Israel, but in Jerusalem, the feeling is that something else is at stake. And if I'm in Jerusalem, I am Jerusalem's protector. I'm the protector because otherwise, we will all lose Jerusalem. Psalm 15, and in many ways, it's a battle between Kings 1:6 and Psalm 15. Psalm 15 says, who may sojourn in your tent? Who may dwell in your holy mountain? He who lives without blame, who does what is right, and in his heart acknowledges the truth, whose tongue is not given to evil, who has never done harm to his fellow or borne reproach for his acts towards his neighbor, for whom a contemptible man is abhorrent, who honors those who fear the Lord, who stands by his oath even to his hurt, who has never lent money at interest or accepted a bribe against the innocent. The man who acts thus shall never be shaken. The whole prophetic fight. Here is the cultural war of over Jerusalem. What is the Judaism of responsibility? What is it that makes you worthy of being the master of Jerusalem? Is it moral excellence? Does the meaning of Zionism require of us that we have, and I'm going to speak about this on Wednesday, a shared moral discourse, a shared moral aspiration, which transcends our beliefs and transcends our denominations and transcends our national identities, and we could speak about one shared moral standard, and if you want to be the master of Jerusalem, you have to live to that standard of excellence. What we all call the universal ethical principles of the prophets. And Psalms reflects that. Or is it v'shamartem et kol mitzvotai? Conceptually both are coherent. Conceptually both are part of the Jerusalem responsibility. I can't argue against the validity of the argument. I can mourn the consequences. But I can't argue that Psalms by definition trumps the argument of Kings. I believe that part of our responsibility under the Jerusalem of peoplehood is to develop that nature, or what my father used to speak about, a shared Torah, that the Torah of Israel would somehow be a shared Torah, that Israel requires of us to do something different than what we do in our shuls, that Jerusalem requires of us not to turn it into our own particular denomination, but to recognize that we are in control of something bigger, that we're in control of something that belongs to the whole Jewish people. as Yehuda was speaking about in 1970. This homeland of the Jewish people means that you have to do Judaism differently. Not Judaism on an individual level, but that the Judaism of the public sphere cannot be the Judaism of your shul. That's okay in Tel Aviv. But for so many, Jerusalem is a shul. And the one Jerusalem that I didn't put here is normal Jerusalem. Does normal Jerusalem require that this is not a shul, but your ta'ava and your yetzer hara? Could Jerusalem not be a shul? And if it is a shul, is it a shul of Psalms or a shul of Kings makes all the difference in the world. And again, I would posit, this is why Jerusalem is the front line for the possible success or failure of Zionism. Because in Tel Aviv, it's easy. It's here. How are you going to work it out? And that's why the Kotel is so important. And it's so interesting in the Supreme Court decision of 2003, in the majority opinion put forth by Chesed, and the minority opinion put forth by Alon, not Menachem Elon. Menachem Elon says, why are you guys even talking about the Kotel? Dealing with the first petition of the Women of the Wall. Says, you can't talk about it. Immediately after the Six-Day War, Israel passes a law in which we declare our commitment to protect the sanctity of all holy sites. And he said, we don't have to protect only the holy sites of Christianity and Islam, we also have to protect the holy sites of Jews. The Kotel is a synagogue, he says, by virtue of which you, the Supreme Court, have no jurisdiction here. The only one who has jurisdiction over religious holy sites are those who protect those holy sites, and that's the rabbis. And in Israel, we have only one official rabbinate, and they're the ones in control of the Kotel, and therefore, you don't even have a vote. And Chesed comes and he argues, I'm sorry. He declares, and the foundation of his argument is that the Kotel is not a synagogue. The Jerusalem of God, the Jerusalem of... It's bigger than that. It's something symbolic of the Jewish people. How do we Zionize Jerusalem in a city where many of the people aren't Zionists is a very, very serious challenge. The Jerusalem of loss. This is one that you would think was yesterday's conversation. One of the great challenges of Israel, however, is that we are now a nuclear superpower with a consciousness of still living by the rivers of Babylon. We're still on the rivers of Babylon. There we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There our poplars were we hung up our lyres. For our captors asked us there for a song, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. Galut is not just a physical shift in Jewish existence. It's a dramatic shift in a sense of dignity and pride and self-respect. Galut is where we are humiliated. Galut is where we are powerless. Galut is where our enemies say, amuse me. Amuse me, dance. For me, what would it be to live in the Wild West without muscles or being able to use a gun? It's like, that feeling, that hopelessness. Like, what is the average farmer supposed to do with the gunslinger? Well, we had that experience this is the story on the rivers of Babylon. Sing for me a song. And the only thing that we could do, the only thing that we could have control over, is we could choose silence. That's all. We can't sing. They want a song of Zion and we don't. But with silence, our power comes to an end. And we sit there and we fester. And we feel the humiliation. We feel the degradation. And as year after year passes, we began to fantasize, not of our victory, but of revenge. And in the verses that very few people learn, we now move from an expression and a depiction of our shame and humility to a prayer. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cried. Strip her to her very foundation. Fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on him who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us. A blessing on him who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks. There's a reason why we skip. This comes straight out of Eicha. A people who experienced Eicha don't only want victory, they want revenge. Jerusalem is the city of loss. It was the carrier of what it meant to be a free, dignified people, living in our land, living with our God, living in the world as we were promised it should be. Not being in Jerusalem, Jerusalem was that which symbolized for us everything that we lost. That's why it was also so easy. And my father again used to speak about this all the time. It's so easy for people to go to Yad Vashem, to see the Jews as a weak people. Are we the masters of Jerusalem? And whenever Israelis hear someone's wanting to internationalize Jerusalem, for us, that's putting us back by the rivers of Babylon. You want to put us back there. You want to take away from us the fact that we've come home. But what happens when so deeply embedded in the Jerusalem of loss is the fantasy of vengeance? And what happens when we have the power to extract that vengeance? How do we forget the Jerusalem of loss? Because Jerusalem of loss is critical when you're not in Jerusalem, but it's unbelievably dangerous when you are the sovereign of Jerusalem. And Israelis, one of the fascinating, you see it, and it violates core principles of the Zionist narrative. More and more Israelis believe that we are in 1938. And at the same time, we're a superpower. What are the consequences of the two? Do you see others? Do you see the consequence of what you're causing to others? What is the meaning of this flag march through the Arab quarter, the Muslim quarter? The same Supreme Court which will not allow the gay parade to march on Rehov Yafo because it violates the feelings and sensibilities of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem, permits the march in the Muslim quarter under the argument of freedom of speech. And the gay parade could only march in Jerusalem when it left Rehov Yafo, and it goes to Rehov Agron, and it makes a right turn up King David Street and ends here, and now it's in the reverse. You can march as long as there's 4 or 5, unless there's a half a kilometer between the parade and Mea Shearim. So now you march from here, you go up Keren HaYesod, you go on to King George, and you don't go to Yafo, you make a right turn on Hillel, and then you go down Hillel you never go beyond Hillel Street. There's a buffer zone. Because according to the basic law of human freedom and dignity of 1992, people's feelings in Israel have to be respected. Because not to respect your feelings is not to treat you as a dignified human being. It's fascinating to compare the application of whose feelings count. The Supreme Court says that when somebody's feelings are hurt, that takes precedence over freedom of speech. Not just shouting fire in a crowded cinema, But if your speech hurts my feelings to a very, very large degree, and there's whole criteria, many of you studied that with us here. Those of you who've used I Engage 2 saw those sources. But it doesn't apply in the Muslim quarter. Why? Because I want vengeance. I want vengeance. And we bring this story to a conclusion with the Jerusalem of hope. Because Jerusalem was never just the Jerusalem of loss. When we dreamt of the world as we wanted it to be, the first city that changed was Jerusalem. That's where our hopes were first and foremost going to be fulfilled. And that's why 1967 was such a messianic moment in ways that 1948 could never be. Because unless Jerusalem was part of the equation, 1948 was not a messianic moment. As Yossi Klein Halevi writes so beautifully about when he presents Rav Kook's speech. When right before the war in 1967, he reflects back on his feelings. When everybody's celebrating the formation of the state and the partition plan, Rav Kook, Tzvi Yehuda, says, how can I celebrate this? This is not the... When you have Jerusalem, it was Jerusalem first and foremost through which our hopes were unfolded or realized. And here too again, we have multiple hopes. There is a hope, as you saw in Tractate Makot with Rabbi Akiva, that when, just as in Jerusalem, when the wolves, or was it the wolves who were foxes, wolves, when the foxes prowl in Jerusalem, there is hope that one day we will come back. That my dream for Jerusalem is the fulfillment of Jewish national sovereignty. That for me to be the master of Jerusalem is for me to be at home again. Jerusalem carries the idea of Jewish national aspirations. I simply want to be an Am Chofshi Ba'artzi. That's it. I don't need more than that. And I am fully an Am Chofshi Ba'artzi when I am in Jerusalem. And there is a strong Dayenu there. But there's another part of the Jerusalem of hope which has a similar paradox to the Jerusalem of God. Because our hopes, as expressed by the prophets, sometimes ended with a transformation in Jewish political life and status. But more often than not, our aspirations were not simply our return from exile, but a transformation of the world. Our hopes were not just for our victory, but for a different type of reality within which we will live. Isaiah 2, in the day to come, the mount of the Lord's house shall stand firm, on page 28, shall stand firm above the mountains and tower above the hills, and all the nations shall gaze on it with joy. And the many people shall go and say, come, let us go up to the mount of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may instruct us in his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For instruction shall come forth from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge amongst the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war. Jerusalem, as the city of God, is the city which is going to create a transformation in the way the world conducts itself, in the way people see each other. A day will come that not merely are we going to come back to Jerusalem, as Zechariah says, but everybody is going to understand that God is God, and everybody's going to come back to Jerusalem. And this city will be a city that we share with everyone. Ki mitzion teitzei Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. The Torah that comes out of Zion is not the Torah of Sinai. We make a mistake. That's not the Torah of Sinai. It's a new Torah. It's not the Torah of Shabbos and Kashrus and Shatnez. The Torah that comes out of Tzion is a Torah in which people will no longer engage in war and justice will ring forth throughout the land. That's Ki Mitzion Teitzei Torah. The Torah of Tzion is different than the Torah of Sinai. It's a day in which God will be God. It's a day in which people will see each other differently. But the paradox, if Jerusalem is truly the Jerusalem of hope, could you really be the sovereign over Jerusalem? You're the sovereign over something that's bigger than you. Just like you're the sovereign over a city once it's the city of God, it's bigger than you. Your hope is bigger than you. I'm not talking about the technical question of where you put the boundaries and whether Jerusalem should be internationalized. That's not my issue. It's the internalization of the idea that you are carrying something that's supposed to be bigger than your national interests. What do you dream about? What do you aspire for? Jerusalem is what pushes you to dream. And therefore, what are the dreams that you bring to Jerusalem are going to determine the future of Zionism, are going to determine your politics. What is it that you want? Is Jerusalem a city that's going to bring forth peace, or is Jerusalem a city that's going to bring forth your triumphant declaration of the superiority of the chosen people of Israel? What does it mean to be the sovereign over Jerusalem? What are your responsibilities, not merely in your practice, but what are your responsibilities vis-a-vis the dreams that you continue to articulate? 50 years after we were able to declare the Temple Mount is in our hands, multiple Jerusalems attack our senses. The Jerusalem of God, does it create a fantasy of nationalism, or does it create a very, very deep religious humility? The Jerusalem of prayer, whose voice is heard? And I forgot to say this beforehand, but for most Israelis, it's not just the Jerusalem of God, it's actually the Jerusalem of prayer, which makes it incoherent that we cannot pray on the Temple Mount. I remember going up on the Temple Mount as a guest of the Waqf with a group of Christian and Muslims who were at a theology conference here. I had two people walking next to me every single moment. Lest for 1 second I mumble. I wasn't allowed to move my lips other than vocalized speech, and there were two people making sure. Because if I said something, then somehow I was undermining Muslims' dignity and their Islam's dignity and place in Jerusalem. And the Jerusalem of prayer, the fantasy that we will determine whose voice is heard. For Israelis, both because of the Jerusalem of God and because of the Jerusalem of prayer and because of the Jerusalem of loss and because of the Jerusalem of hope, the idea, we accept it as politically necessary, but there's something so small and pasnished about it. But we are so sensitive to our desire to have our voice heard. And as always, that exhausts us, and we're less sensitive to the need of other people's voices to be heard. And while we Jews are very sensitive to Christian and Muslims, it's when it comes to Jews that we have greater difficulty. The Jerusalem of peoplehood, Jerusalem of responsibility, and the Jerusalem of hope are in many ways the front lines of the cultural war that we are engaging and which will determine the future of the state of Israel. 50 years ago, we had an unbelievable bracha. The Temple Mount is in our hands. And now we have one small little challenge: to make sure that it indeed remains a bracha. Thank you. And now we have some time for questions. I see one, 2, 3. Just waiting a second. Okay, we'll start with the three of you. I did 1, 2, 3, and then we'll do another round. And I apologize, I don't remember. Yes, I think you first. Yes, please, sir. 1, 2, right. Yes.
So thank you. Great. I understand how this applies to West Jerusalem and the Old City. Is it a different context for the Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem?
Depends who you ask. Jerusalem is a divided city now. It's divided amongst the Jews. It's divided between Jews and Palestinians. Can Jerusalem have a border in the midst of it? I have no idea. But I don't know if some of you who might have gone on a tiyul here many years ago, or a few years ago, we did a similar move to the Kotel. We discovered that Jerusalem actually could expand. We are against the dividing of Jerusalem. Will be the united capital of the Jewish people for now and all eternity. What constitutes Jerusalem? What we call Jerusalem will never be divided, but we will allow Palestinians to call something Jerusalem, even though we think it's not Jerusalem. But since we're willing to divide your Jerusalem. Again, simple, right? What's known in Hebrew, win-win, right? Vin-vin, everybody's happy, vin-vin. Tal Becker told you his story about vin-vin? Love it. Vin-vin. Here, Abu Dis. You think it's Jerusalem? For me, it's not Jerusalem. You're happy. As long as you're happy, I'm happy. A building is built in Abu Dis. Literally, just to show you how small people are, we measure the distance between the Knesset to the Kotel, the same equidistance between Al-Aqsa is where they put the potential new Palestinian parliament. Building is there. Vin-vin. It's not, I'm not dividing Jerusalem, I'm giving you Abu Dis. A certain Jewish philanthropist with an abundance of money starts purchasing buildings directly between Al-Aqsa and that which is not Jerusalem, to make it impossible to divide that which I don't think is Jerusalem. So what's the future of Jerusalem? It'll depend on what we call Jerusalem. And whether you're willing to call the Jerusalem that fulfills your hopes, or whether it's your fantasy of vengeance and control. It's, again, as to the political, how to divide Jerusalem is beyond my pay grade. I have no insightful Torah on that issue. There's people who've written very detailed papers on whether it's possible or not possible. We could divide a city. Whether we could divide Jerusalem is a separate, and then what is Jerusalem? But I would leave it at that. Yes, please.
Just in terms of 2 points of information that I need to provide further context. The last point, important point that you made, of course, stands in total clash with what is happening in the Knesset now. Not only is there no willingness to apply creative interpretation, but what is now being legislated in the Knesset is that Jerusalem is Jerusalem, and everything else we call Jerusalem, even though it never was Jerusalem, and no one will have the right or authority to interfere with the integrity of this expanded Jerusalem unless they have the support of 18 members of Knesset. And the second point is that, following the last point that you made regarding the temple, again, it's so important. But it's important for us to understand that as much as the thrust was about what we Jews do and what we hold to be the Jewish calling, the sad reality is this isn't just our problem. And the only issue ever where the chief rabbi, the
Manyen. No, it's one of the things, and I speak about this a lot, and I've spoken to you about it a lot, and I spoke about it on the opening night, where it's a solemn time right now. And Jerusalem is complicated enough, but you see how it activates. Every one of these Jerusalems, you could see how it shapes current politics, how it influences the way you think and what you do, and the decisions you make. And part of one way to analyze certain things going on in the Knesset is to see how we haven't gotten over the Jerusalem of loss and the weight of the desire for vengeance or the desire to control. There are coalitions which have nothing to do with the coalitions in the government. There are conceptual ideological coalitions, which are very, very frightening today. And that's why the battle or the struggle over the Kotel is much bigger than that. It really is a struggle over what Jerusalem and what Zionism is going to mean. I don't remember. I pointed to somebody. Yes, please, sir? And then I'll do a second round.
So, going to the Jerusalem responsibility, I'm wondering if folks are, or we worry about folks taking that to the extreme, by which I mean, if there's a community that wants to live in Jerusalem by let's say, a Psalm 15 code, is that group not a group of road beings? In other words, reckoning the sovereignty as therefore...
You started your question by, should we be worried? The answer is yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. This is very serious stuff. This is my survival.
Specifically about being declared holy beings.
We just, in Israel, we don't use the word anymore, but it still infuses much of our thought processes. I'm just looking at the hands again. I'm just trying to make a quick check in the room. Okay, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That order? Yes, please, ma'am.
So in the beginning, when you talked about, there was just a small reference to Christian, the impact on Christians of this whole conversation, and sort of said that it was derivative. Their interest is really just derivative on us. But could you go a little deeper in talking about more of the impact of, say, these themes on the Christian thought or Christian theology?
I would say to you that just al regel echad, Jerusalem of God and the Jerusalem of hope are of particular importance in Christianity. The others, over time, have been replaced. Peoplehood is not a central doctrine. And I would say much of Christian thinking around Jerusalem, now you could probably have Jerusalem also, Jerusalem of hope and of God are the dominant, would be dominant dimensions. Loss would be irrelevant for now. I hope that is that sufficient, or did I not understand something? Go on, come again.
We spent an hour and 15 minutes talking about this with the rabbis. Are they having these kinds of conversations about the same?
No. But they too have listen, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the keys are held by Muslims. They don't know how to get along with each other either. It also, the Jerusalem of God drives them totally bananas. Are they having this level? Probably not. Probably not. Yes, please, sir.
I didn't hear you talk about the two Amichai poems that you have in here, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how his relationship with Jerusalem fits into your framework.
Yes, thank you. Choices. I especially love the Amichai prayer in Jerusalem. I found it I read it. Oh, it's just. We'll turn to it. It's on page 15. Jerusalem of prayer, for him, even though he doesn't pray theologically, the idea that Jerusalem is the place where you pray, the imageries of Ne'ilah, of the closing of the gates, as everyone else has the heavenly gates, other gates are closing for him. He prays, for him, prayer here is a conversation between him and the Arab who lives in Jerusalem, each one with their own narrative. Jerusalem, it's the Jerusalem of my past meeting your past. I just love this. He was called on Yom Kippur to do an Aliyah Regel. But he doesn't do an Aliyah Regel to be seen by God. He doesn't have an Aliyah Regel to pray to God. He has an Aliyah Regel to speak about his feelings, to share them with the people who he's living in Jerusalem. And when I finished, it was time for the closing of the gates of prayer. And he therefore, what is the gates of prayer? That's Ne'ilah, but for him, it's the gates of our little conversation, and then the shutters are closed. So just Jerusalem is where you put forth everything that's in your soul. That's what Jerusalem demands of you and calls of you. That's and the other one we don't have the time, but the notion that in Jerusalem everybody's lost something. And part of the problem is that you can never have a win-win if everybody's lost something. Everybody is in Jerusalem feeling that loss, and consequently you have no hope, you have no ability to compromise. I think that's the second idea of that's the other Amichai, a place where everybody's lost something. But I'll then, yes, please.
These are wonderful thoughts about Israel and Jerusalem, but for us in the diaspora, we're very much this Yerushalayim Ramallah, Yerushalayim Lamata, the practicality. It appears the Israelis have accepted the Lamata Yerushalayim, and they disengaged from the parts they don't like. We in the diaspora have always connected to the Ma'ala, Jerusalem, the holy. My question is, seeing what has happened the last couple of weeks and the Kobo decision, is it dangerous for us diaspora to see Jerusalem Lamata and disengage like Israelis?
I think the essential, I was going to end with this, is that I think one of the interesting things about Jerusalem is that there is no distinction between Jerusalem Shalmala and Mata. They're squished. If they were separate, it's easy. It's easy praying to a Jerusalem. It's the Jerusalem of prayer. If God lives in the Jerusalem Shalmala, no problem. There's always this space. The problem is in Jerusalem that it's the one place on earth that there is no distinction between Lamala and Lamata. I would almost say Lamala and Lamata is a diasporic creation. The person, the minute we say Har Habayit Biyadenu, the two get squished together. And now Jerusalem Shalmala and Jerusalem Shalmata have to work themselves out and have to find a way to, because they're in, you don't want, Jerusalem has to be both a normal, but it's not a normal city. Because all of these ideas, it's not just how you clean the garbage, everything that goes on here. Which movies, which parking lots, is this movie theater allowed to be open on Shabbos or not? Where? How do we divide it? Which neighborhood? All of the above. There's so many, the constant functioning of the municipality here is not a functioning in a way that just simply looks at municipal questions. They're constantly infused by the fact that Jerusalem Shalmala is squished and influences, what do I give to Palestinians? How do I clean their garbage? What do I march? Where don't I march? What schools? Funding. Not to speak about all the holy other religious sites, the religious issues, state and religion here in Jerusalem. Now, Please repeat as to the issue of what's dangerous or not for world Jewry. Because it's true, world Jewry, it's much easier.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Israelis, they, especially Israelis in Tel Aviv, the Kotel's not important to them. They disengage and say, that is not my Israel. But a diaspora Jew, Jerusalem
Yes.
is essential, the Kotel is essential.
No, you
and now
do.
we've been slapped in the face.
It's interesting, yes. It's a very interesting thing that with all of Israel's policy statements about Jerusalem, what is it, a half of Israelis never visit Jerusalem or some crazy number, have never come, and the army and schools bring you up here for it once or twice, but it's their city. But it's
But the diaspora Jews disengage like that.
you can't. And the truth is, if you look at Israeli legislation, neither could Israelis. Israelis disengage from certain things, but they don't disengage from other. And part of what we've learned is that if you want to change the Kotel, it's not by putting the Jerusalem of God in heaven, but it's by teaching people that you can't be masters of the Jerusalem of God. It's not by disconnecting Jerusalem from prayer, but making sure that the Jerusalem of prayer works with the Jerusalem of peoplehood. Notice, it's not by creating for Israelis another void. We have to fill up that void with a different Torah so that they'll fight for that type of Jerusalem. But it's interesting, Israelis speak about the centrality of Jerusalem, but in many ways, they're allowing a distancing of so much of what they care about from Jerusalem. So there's this, and then North American Jews are saying, hello, Jerusalem is Jerusalem the capital of Israel? Is Jerusalem the capital of the Jewish people? Or is Jerusalem even important? Or could I just live with the Jerusalem in the heavens? I think the solution is not to have Israelis disengage or just have a Jerusalem of earth and Jerusalem, but it's to change the way or the consequences in which when the two are infused with each other. When that happens, we're going to have a different Torah in Israel, and then we have a chance. Yes, please?
So in our coverage that we were talking about, we were going back to the Jerusalem clock and Psalm 137, and somebody pointed out Yom Yerushalayim is there, and it's there specifically, verse 7, that's where it starts that turn to the unpleasant implement. Was that specifically when it's called Yom Yerushalayim, really referencing?
I don't know. Possibly, I really don't know. Yom Yerushalayim does attest, just like Amichai does, that Jerusalem is not just Yerushalayim Shalmata. But one of the interesting realities that Yom Yerushalayim has become a holiday only for the Tzionut Hadati. Now, recently in Yerushalayim, there's been a fascinating development of the Tnuah Yerushalmi to create alternate forms of Yom Yerushalayim celebrations. I don't know. It would be interesting. Unfortunately, Yom Yerushalayim today is more an expression of the second half of 137. But that's not what it needs to be. Yes, please. And then last question and we'll end. Yes.
So I want to go back to the Jerusalem of responsibility, because you say something about, when we say Har Habayit B'Yadeinu, I think one of the things is that left, right, or center, we don't trust if it's in somebody else's hands, because when it wasn't B'Yadeinu, we didn't have access to it. So how does that consciousness, no matter who you are, diaspora or Israel, left, right, or center, how does that continue to influence your Jerusalem and responsibility?
You mean the responsibility to retain our control over it? Very, very deep. There is nobody in Israel, political left or political right, even if you want to divide, who would be willing to internationalize Jerusalem. None of us have great trust in the international community. That's just not, but it's not just trust. Part of the Zionist story is our taking responsibility for our destiny. It's our taking responsibility for our hopes, our dreams, So giving up Jerusalem is an anathema. It's something that most Israelis won't even think about. Dividing Jerusalem, the only way you could politically speak about it is by creating a Jerusalem which is not, the Jerusalem that you divide is not Jerusalem. But relinquishing control that's why Jerusalem is the story of Zionism. It used to be that the Zionists thought that the story of Israel was Tel Aviv. The story of Israel is Jerusalem. Last question, and then we'll conclude. Please. A little louder, please. See, there's nothing for you to worry about. Because if it happens, Jerusalem will basically stop being Jerusalem. Jerusalem, which is not the Jerusalem of peoplehood, is not Jerusalem. Jerusalem, which is not a city that we hope for, is not your Jerusalem. And if Jerusalem becomes Bnei Brak, then we'll create a new Jerusalem. In fact, we will. So there's nothing, Jerusalem is bigger and needs to be bigger. How do you convince people to stay? You can't. The reality is that Jerusalem has some of the greatest religious diversity in Israel. On this, this current mayor has been a huge bracha. While it hasn't changed the demographics yet, one of the things that is helping Jerusalem's future is the price of real estate. People forget that Beitar and Modi'in Eilit are all byproducts of the price of the cost of, and Emmanuel are byproducts of the cost of real estate in Jerusalem. The Haredi growth, on the one hand, remains in Jerusalem, but moves outside of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem can be a divided city. The Supreme Court works on it. There are blueprints. Part of our goal is not to create a city in which the Haredim are disempowered or they're the enemy, or a place where religious Zionists can't express their national aspirations, or where secular Israelis can't have their Shabbat, and conservative reform and liberals. Jerusalem, we're all here. We're all here. And whether you want to fight for it is the question. Whether you care enough about it is the question. It's easy to legislate a one-day demonstration. Or it's easy for the Supreme Court to say, women of the wall, it's only 11 days a year. For 11 days a year, you guys will have to control yourself. That was easy. It's how do we create a Jerusalem which 365 days a year? Where could we make this happen? The Zionist dream is not about the destruction of ultra-Orthodoxy. It's about all of us re-engaging with each other in a different way. And a very beautiful way to end is with all of our friends, Tamar Alad Applebaum's Midrash. It's just, I heard she gave this as a speech here, and I asked her to write it. But prophets speak. It's like when it came to writing. But she was sitting here in front of 400 people on this conference that we had in the David Hartman Conference for Israel as a Jewish Democratic State. And she was speaking about what does it mean, Hayinu kecholmim? What does it mean to be dreamers? Could we, as she beautifully says here, is Jerusalem a place where is the repository of our dreams? And then it gets really squishy. It gets really dense here, and my dream is fighting your dream because there's no room. Or is Jerusalem a place where everyone is obligated to be a dreamer? And that to be sovereign of over Jerusalem is to make sure that in our political aspirations for this city, we don't look merely at what is, but we look at what ought to be. And the cultural war that we are engaging in is to make sure that our country has a vision of what ought to be, that is worthy of Israel, worthy of Zionism, and worthy of the Jewish people. Thank you.